Friday, September 20th, 1935. Harlem, West 142nd Street. Lucky Luciano arrived with 50 men to measure Harlem's obedience. Across the table sat one man, alone, with no gun and no bravado. What followed wasn't revenge or pride, but a cold demonstration of intelligence. Luciano left knowing Harlem could not be taken by force. So how did Bumpy Johnson survive and make the mafia never return to understand the result? We have to go back to the first move. 8:17 in the evening, and Duke Ellington bled through the walls of the front room like smoke trapped in fabric. The backroom door closed with a solid click that severed the music mid-phrase, leaving only breath and the small creaking sounds that old wood made under the weight of consequence. Lucky Luciano walked through that door at 37 years old, wearing a suit tailored in Milan that cost more than most Harlem families earned in 6 months. The diamond ring on his right hand caught light and threw it back in sharp angles. In his hands he carried a chess set that had belonged to Arnold Rothstein, the man who had taught Luciano that violence was crude and strategy was eternal. This was not a gift. This was a reminder delivered in wood and ivory. Bumpy Johnson sat waiting at the table, 30 years old, dressed simply with no jewelry except a watch that kept time. He had not come to beg. He had come to force acknowledgement from men who believed acknowledgement was something they granted rather than extracted. Luciano set the board on the table between them and laid out terms in a voice stripped of courtesy. Just the two of us. Witnesses stay outside. We do not discuss business until we have a result on this board. What happens here determines what happens everywhere else. My 50 men waited in the building and on the street outside. 25 loyal to Luciano and 25 representing Harlem. All of them understanding that the next hour would establish whether Harlem operated as independent territory or as tributary state paying tribute to Italian families who believed they owned New York by divine right and superior firepower. In the front room, Luciano's men whispered among themselves, "If the Negro wins, it is an insult to the family. We break his fingers after and call it a lesson in respect." One of them touched the grip of a revolver tucked into his waistband, the gesture casual but deliberate, making sure everyone saw where his hand rested. Across the room, Harlem's representatives conducted their own conference. "If Bumpy loses, we pay tribute starting tomorrow. They will bleed us dry within a year, and anyone who complains gets a gasoline necklace and a match." Pooh, before arriving at the club. Bumpy had stopped at a small chapel 3 blocks away. He had sat in a back pew with his hands on wood worn smooth by generations of grip, feeling the cold penetrate through his palms and into his chest, using the chill to slow his heart rate. On the walk back, he had passed through the club's front room where someone had opened a bottle of Barolo from 1934. The smell reached him as he moved toward the back room. Rich and heavy, designed to make men comfortable and careless. Bumpy had constructed his approach in discrete steps. First, accept the meeting in neutral territory because refusing would mark Harlem as afraid. Second, present himself without the visible markers of wealth that Luciano wore like armor, forcing people to look at intelligence rather than gold. Third, study Luciano's playing style through every available source. Luciano played aggressively, seizing central control early, believing his experience would grind down any challenger. Fourth, prepare a specific trap designed to convert Luciano's aggression into vulnerability. Fifth, and most important, prepare the words to speak after victory. Mockery would force Luciano to respond with violence. The correct response would be brief, sharp enough to draw understanding, calibrated to leave Luciano an exit that preserved his authority while acknowledging Bumpy's capability. Luciano looked at Bumpy the way a professor looked at a student taking an examination. His expression carried no hostility, no warmth, Nothing except a cool assessment of a man who had seen hundreds of challengers and watched most collapse under pressure. "Before we begin," Luciano said, arranging the white pieces with practiced efficiency, "let me be clear about what this game represents. You win. We discuss terms as equals. You lose. Harlem pays 20% of gross receipts starting next Monday. 20% of everything. Numbers, policy, protection, narcotics if you are foolish enough to touch it. My collectors will visit every operation you run, and if the math does not add up, we start breaking bones until someone remembers how to count properly." Bumpy's jaw tightened, the only visible response. "And if I win?" "Then you have earned respect," Luciano replied, his tone suggesting this outcome existed only as a theoretical possibility rather than probable result. "But understand something, Johnson. Respect in our world is not a guarantee of safety. It is merely an acknowledgement that killing you would cost more than it is worth. That calculation can change why. Men who think respect makes them invincible tend to end up in the river with their throats cut and their pockets filled with stones to ensure they stay down where nobody has to look at them." One of Luciano's men leaned against the doorframe, cleaning his fingernails with a knife blade that caught light the same way the diamond ring did. "Boss is being generous tonight," he said, voice carrying into the back room despite the supposed privacy. "Last Negro who tried to negotiate terms with the family got his hands nailed to a table in Red Hook. Took him 6 hours to bleed out while we explained the importance of knowing your place in the natural order of things." Bumpy understood the real trap now. It was not on the chessboard. It was in the room itself, in the presence of 50 witnesses who would carry this story back to every corner of New York's criminal underworld. If Luciano lost and felt humiliated, chess would be abandoned, and guns would make their argument in the only language that guns spoke fluently. Therefore, Bumpy needed to win in a way that demonstrated superiority without destroying Luciano's ability to function as the boss who commanded respect. The victory needed to be swift and clean and undeniable, leaving no room for claims that luck had altered the result. But it also needed to leave Luciano an exit, a way to acknowledge Bumpy's skill without admitting personal inadequacy. Stephanie St. Clair had given Bumpy a final instruction before he left for this meeting. Words delivered in the flat tone of someone who had survived in Harlem longer than most men survived anywhere. "You win this game, and we operate independently for the next decade. You lose, and I start shopping for a coffin large enough to hold both of us because they will put us in the ground together as an example to anyone else who thinks colored people deserve autonomy in a white man's city." Luciano's hand moved toward his king's pawn. "We play one game. The winner determines how we proceed. The loser accepts the result without complaint or excuse. This is how men settle questions that cannot be settled through discussion." Bumpy nodded once, the gesture small and economical. His hands moved to the black pieces, positioning them with equal precision. The room fell silent except for breathing and the small sounds of men shifting weight, trying to find positions that could be held without cramping. In the front room, someone whispered a prayer in Italian, asking saints for favorable outcomes and profitable arrangements. In the opposite corner, one of Harlem's representatives touched a straight razor in his pocket, the kind with a bone handle and a blade stropped sharp enough to split hairs or open throats depending on what the evening required. The clock on the wall ticked forward. Luciano's hand closed around his pawn. The game began, and with it the countdown to determine whether Harlem would survive the night as independent territory or wake up tomorrow morning wearing Italian chains that would never be removed, except through the kind of violence that left entire city blocks soaked in fluids that required industrial cleaning equipment to remove from pavement. In this world, a bullet created only fear that dissipated as soon as the shooter left the room. But a move made correctly, a trap set properly, A victory earned through intelligence rather than intimidation, that created order, and order, once established, became the foundation on which everything else was built. Luciano's hand moved to his king's pawn with the confidence of a man who had won this game 100 times before it started. A4, the most aggressive opening in chess, seizing control of the center and announcing intention without subtlety or apology. Bumpy responded with C5, the Sicilian defense, and the choice carried weight beyond the board. Luciano's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing not just the opening, but the message embedded in its selection. The Sicilian was named for Luciano's ancestral homeland, the island where his family had learned that survival required cunning, and that strength without intelligence was just another word for dead. "You know the old country's defenses," Luciano said, his voice carrying an edge that had not been there before. "Someone taught you well, or maybe you just got lucky reading the right book." The room fell silent enough to hear the chess pieces contact wood, each small click echoing off walls that had absorbed years of smoke and whiskey and conversations that ended with bodies in the river. Luciano developed his pieces rapidly, bringing out knights and bishops with practiced efficiency, each move increasing pressure on Bumpy's position, creating the impression that the game was already decided. In the front room, Luciano's men began to smile. One of them whispered in Italian, words that carried just far enough. 3 more moves, and the Negro will be begging for mercy. Maybe we break both his knees and make him crawl back to Harlem, so everyone sees what happens when colored people forget their place. Harlem's side of the room had gone cold. Every man there understood chess well enough to recognize when someone was being pressed backward, when defensive options narrowed and the endgame became visible like storm clouds promising violence. Bumpy had studied Luciano's playing style for 3 weeks before this meeting, learning the patterns that governed how he thought about advantage and pressure. Luciano believed in accumulation, in building small edges into overwhelming positions, in making his opponents feel the weight of inevitability pressing down on their throats. The trap required precision timing. First, Bumpy allowed Luciano to capture additional space on the board, conceding squares that looked important but served primarily as distraction. Luciano's confidence increased with each concession, his moves coming faster, his fingers reaching for pieces with less consideration and more instinct. Second, Bumpy waited for the exact moment when confidence transformed into certainty, when Luciano stopped calculating and started moving based on pattern recognition. That moment arrived when Luciano glanced at his men in the front room and allowed himself a small smile. Third, Bumpy pushed his queen forward into a square that appeared vulnerable, a move so apparently careless that even men who barely understood chess could see it as a mistake. The queen sat exposed, attacked by Luciano's rook, defended by nothing. In the front room, Luciano's men laughed. He just gave away his queen. The game is finished. Fourth, Bumpy positioned his knight on a square that threatened nothing immediately visible, but controlled 3 critical squares that would become important only after Luciano committed to capturing the queen. Luciano reached for his rook, fingers hovering over the piece. The smell of aged wine mixed with stale tobacco hung in the air, thick enough to taste. From the front room, the sound of a clock ticking penetrated the closed door, each mechanical pulse counting down toward conclusion. Luciano's fingers closed around his rook, and before he completed the move, he spoke words that men speak when they believe they have won. Mistake. Bumpy. Fatal mistake. You just handed me the game. And now I am going to make you watch while I dismantle everything you thought you had built. Bumpy's voice came back flat and level, stripped of emotion. Go ahead and take it. Take the queen and see what happens next. Luciano captured the queen, removing Bumpy's most powerful piece from the board. For exactly 2 seconds, the smile on Luciano's face grew wider, reaching his eyes in a way that genuine amusement produced. Then Bumpy moved his knight, and the smile disappeared, like someone had reached across the table and physically torn it off Luciano's face. The knight landed on a square that accomplished 3 things simultaneously. It placed Luciano's king in check. It attacked Luciano's queen, and it blocked the retreat square for Luciano's rook. The piece that had just captured Bumpy's queen and now found itself trapped with no way to withdraw to safety. 50 men understood in the same instant what Bumpy had done. The queen had not been abandoned through carelessness. The queen had been deployed as bait, offered as sacrifice to lure Luciano's rook into a position where it could be killed, along with everything it was supposed to be protecting. Luciano moved his king out of check, the only legal move available, and Bumpy captured the rook. The material count now showed that Luciano had lost 14 points of value in exchange for capturing 9 points. But the real damage was positional. Luciano's king sat exposed in the center of the board, stripped of defensive cover, surrounded by Bumpy's pieces that had been developing quietly while everyone's attention focused on the queen's sacrifice. In the front room, one of Luciano's men dropped the knife he had been using to clean his fingernails. The blade clattered against the floor like a small bell announcing something that nobody wanted to hear. Bumpy moved his remaining pieces into attacking formation with mechanical precision, each placement forcing Luciano to respond defensively. Each response narrowing options until options no longer existed. At 8:23 in the evening, 6 minutes after the game had begun, Bumpy moved his bishop and spoke the 2 words that ended the contest. Checkmate. Silence held the room for 3 full seconds, 50 men processing what they had just witnessed. Then someone started clapping. The sound came from Luciano's side of the front room. One man applauding slowly and deliberately, the rhythm carrying fear more than appreciation. Another joined, then another, until 25 men were clapping because refusing to clap meant questioning their boss's judgment, and questioning judgment in this world got you buried in New Jersey with lime poured over your remains. Harlem's representatives joined the applause with different energy, relief and triumph mixing together into a sound that celebrated survival as much as victory. Real power did not come from the capacity to break fingers or slit throats or light gasoline-soaked rags and watch buildings burn. Real power came from making your opponent walk into a trap while believing he was executing a winning strategy. From converting his strength into the mechanism of his own defeat. From demonstrating that intelligence properly applied could defeat force no matter how overwhelming that force appeared on the surface. Applause faded, and 50 men held their breath, waiting to see whether lucky Luciano would accept defeat or reach for the gun holstered under his jacket. In the hallway outside, 4 men with Thompson submachine guns stood ready, needing only a single nod to transform the back room into a slaughterhouse where bodies would be wrapped in canvas and dumped in the river with concrete blocks chained to their ankles. Luciano stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. His right hand moved toward his jacket, and every man in Harlem's corner tensed, preparing for the kind of violence that started with muzzle flash and ended with brains splattered across wallpaper that would need replacing before sunrise. One of Luciano's men in the hallway whispered to another, voice low but audible. "Boss loses his temper. We burn this whole block. Gasoline through the windows, phosphorus grenades through the doors. Anyone who runs gets a bullet in the spine. Make it look like gang war so the cops do not dig too deep." Bumpy remained seated, hands folded, expression neutral. He understood that the next 60 seconds would determine whether Harlem survived or whether everyone in this room would be carried out in pieces that would require dental records to identify after the fish finished their work. Luciano's hand emerged from his jacket holding not a revolver, but a silver cigarette case. He extracted a cigarette with deliberate slowness, giving himself time to construct the response that would define how this evening concluded. Bumpy spoke before Luciano could, his voice carrying calculated lightness. That was the Sicilian defense. Lucky. I would argue that makes me more Italian than you are, at least when it comes to understanding how your ancestors thought about protecting territory. The sentence cut like a blade wrapped in laughter, drawing acknowledgement without severing anything vital. Luciano held the unlit cigarette between his fingers for 3 seconds. Then he laughed, a genuine sound that started in his chest, the kind of laughter that men produce when they recognize they have been beaten fairly. "You have steel, Johnson," Luciano said, snapping his cigarette case closed. "Most men who beat me at anything spend the next week looking over their shoulders, waiting for a car to pull up beside them at a red light and a shotgun to come out the window. You sit there making jokes. Either you are the bravest man I have ever met, or you are too stupid to understand how thin the ice is under your feet." "I understand exactly how thin it is," Bumpy replied. "I also understand that killing me now would make you look like a man who cannot accept defeat. That kind of reputation follows you around, and eventually people start wondering if the boss has lost his nerve or his judgment." One of Luciano's men leaned close and whispered in Italian, "We could make it look like Schultz did it. Dutch has been making noise about Harlem anyway. Kill Johnson, pin it on Schultz, then use it as excuse to take out Schultz and absorb his operations. 3 problems solved with 1 bullet." Luciano waved him off with a sharp gesture. "You are thinking like a butcher instead of a businessman. Johnson just proved he has a brain worth more than his funeral would cost. We do not kill assets. We negotiate terms." September 27, 1935 arrived 1 week later. Luciano had requested the rematch personally, sending word that he wanted another game with fewer witnesses. The second game took place in a private room above a restaurant in Little Italy, with only 6 men present instead of 50. This time, Luciano came prepared. Having studied the Sicilian defense with a chess master, he kept on retainer. His play was more cautious, abandoning the aggressive style that had failed the first time. Bumpy adjusted accordingly, adopting a positional approach that accumulated small advantages, tightening control like a garrote around a throat that constricted incrementally until breathing stopped. The game lasted 45 minutes, and when it ended, Bumpy had won again. This time through suffocation rather than dramatic sacrifice. Luciano stared at the board for a long moment, studying the position, as if memorizing it for future analysis. Then he looked up at Bumpy with an expression that carried respect, mixed with wariness. "You are not street muscle," Luciano said. "You are a strategist. That makes you more valuable alive than dead. So I am proposing an arrangement. We meet once a month. We play chess. We talk about what is happening in the city, who is making moves, where problems are developing. No contracts, no obligations, just conversation." He pulled out a leather-bound calendar and opened it to October. "As long as we keep meeting, Harlem operates independent. My people do not collect tribute. They do not interfere with your numbers racket or your policy operations. They do not burn down buildings or break legs to send messages. But understand this clearly, Johnson. The day these monthly games stop, the day you decide you are too important or too busy to sit across from me, that is the day Harlem becomes contested territory again. And contested territory in this city gets resolved through methods that are considerably less civilized than chess." Bumpy nodded once. "Monthly games. Fair conversation. Harlem stays independent as long as the arrangement holds." "One more thing," Luciano added, lighting his cigarette and exhaling smoke toward the ceiling. "This arrangement protects you from me and mine. It does not protect you from Schultz. Dutch is a mad dog who thinks burning down neighborhoods and killing civilians is good business strategy. He is making problems for everyone, bringing heat down on operations that function best in shadow. That problem needs solving, and when it gets solved, I need to know that Harlem will not explode into chaos that draws federal attention. When Schultz disappears, Bumpy said, choosing his words with surgical precision, Harlem will remain quiet. No gang wars, no bodies in the streets, no reason for cops or newspapers to ask uncomfortable questions. Then we understand each other, Luciano replied. Welcome to the arrangement, Johnson. Try not to die before our next game. Finding another chess partner with your particular combination of intelligence and nerve would be inconvenient. This narrative reconstructs historical events for educational analysis of how criminal power operated in the 1930s, not as endorsement of illegal activity. The intelligent do not need to shout or demonstrate strength through broken bones and gasoline fires. They only need to establish a ritual that makes everyone else understand that the rules have changed. Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano had just created such a ritual. And for the next decade, Harlem would operate under its protection. A treaty written not in ink but in the 64 squares of a chessboard, where strategy mattered more than the number of guns you could put on the street. Schultz operated like a man who had never learned that there were rules separating business from butchery. He terrorized Harlem with the subtlety of a gasoline fire, sending his men to collect protection money from businesses that could barely afford to keep their lights on. And when owners protested or came up short, Schultz's collectors broke fingers with ball-peen hammers and left the victim screaming on the sidewalk as education for anyone else considering resistance. His men kidnapped policy bankers in broad daylight, dragging them into cars while witnesses watched from windows and decided that calling police was more dangerous than staying silent. The bankers who cooperated had their operations absorbed. The bankers who refused were found in alleys with their throats cut and their ledgers stolen. Every customer name now property of an organization that viewed murder as routine business expense. Schultz burned buildings when he felt disrespected, sending crews with kerosene and rags to torch storefronts that had failed to pay tribute on time, not caring that families lived in apartments above those stores, not caring that children died in the flames. The fires brought attention from newspapers that ran photographs of charred bodies being carried out on stretchers. And photographs brought pressure from politicians who needed to demonstrate concern. But the real problem was not the violence itself. The real problem was that Schultz's violence attracted Thomas E. Dewey, the special prosecutor who had built his reputation on taking down organized crime figures. Dewey had subpoena power and federal backing and relentless ambition that turned investigations into crusades. He did not care about street-level dealers. He wanted the bosses, the men whose removal would generate headlines. Luciano understood that Schultz's continued existence endangered everyone. Every fire Schultz set, every body Schultz left in public view, all of it drew Dewey closer to operations that functioned best when conducted quietly and concluded without witnesses who might later testify in federal court. Luciano invited Bumpy to dinner at a restaurant in Midtown, a place where Italian families conducted business over food and wine. The table was set with linens that cost more than most men earned in a week, and the wine was Barolo from 1934, the same vintage that had been opened the night Bumpy and Luciano first played chess. Luciano poured the wine himself, the gesture carrying significance because bosses did not typically serve subordinates or equals. Schultz is a problem that needs solving, Luciano said, his voice carrying flat certainty. The commission has voted. He dies before the end of the month. But I need to know something before we proceed. And I need you to answer honestly, because if you lie to me now, and I discover the lie later, our arrangement ends and Harlem becomes open territory where anyone can operate. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, wine glass forgotten. After Schultz disappears, after his organization collapses and his territory becomes available for redistribution, can you keep Harlem peaceful? Can you prevent the kind of gang war that brings cops and newspapers and federal investigators crawling over every operation in the city? Because if Harlem explodes into violence the moment Schultz is removed, then we have accomplished nothing except replacing one problem with 50 smaller problems. Bumpy sipped his wine, using the moment to construct his response. After Schultz is eliminated, Harlem will remain quiet. No gang wars, no bodies in the streets, no reason for newspapers to run photographs or for Dewey to expand his investigation. Words are easy, Luciano replied. Execution is hard. Give me details. Tell me how you plan to accomplish this miracle. Bumpy laid out the plan in 5 steps. First, identify every operator currently working in Harlem, separating those who understood discipline from those who would exploit the chaos. Second, position intermediaries who could resolve disputes before they escalated into violence, using financial incentives and debt obligations to ensure cooperation. Third, maintain visible but not excessive security presence, enough to demonstrate control without attracting police attention. Fourth, control information flow to prevent opportunists from selling details to Dewey or other investigators. Fifth, announce a new order within 24 hours of Schultz's elimination, making clear that anyone who violated the peace would be cut off from revenue streams, eliminating them financially before resorting to violence. Luciano listened without interrupting, expression unreadable. When Bumpy finished, Luciano nodded once. If you accomplish this, if you keep Harlem quiet for 7 days after Schultz dies, then our arrangement continues unchanged. My people do not collect tribute. They do not interfere with your operations. Harlem remains independent. But if you fail, if Harlem becomes a war zone that brings federal heat down on everyone, then our agreement is void, and you will discover that chess games provide no protection against consequences of broken promises. One of Luciano's men, sitting 3 tables away but close enough to hear, leaned toward his companion and whispered loud enough for Bumpy to catch the words. Boss is giving the Negro a lot of rope. The question is whether he uses it to climb or to hang himself. My money says we are back in Harlem before Christmas, collecting tribute and breaking anyone who objects. Luciano shot the man with a look that could freeze water. Your money says whatever I tell it to say. Johnson gets his chance. If he succeeds, we all benefit. If he fails, we handle it then. But right now, you keep your mouth shut and your opinions to yourself, unless you want to find out what it feels like to have your tongue cut out and mailed to your mother as a reminder about the importance of knowing when to speak and when to listen. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. No written contract, no signatures or witnesses who could later testify. Just verbal understanding between 2 men whose word carried weight in circles where written documents meant nothing, and verbal commitments were enforced through methods that left no room for appeal. If Harlem descended into chaos after Schultz's removal, Luciano could claim that he had given Bumpy opportunity for independence, and Bumpy had proven incapable of maintaining order, therefore justifying Italian intervention. The narrative would be simple and believable. We tried cooperation. Cooperation failed. Now we restore order through direct control. Bumpy understood that he was not merely being tested on his ability to keep peace. He was being tested on whether colored operators could manage territory at the same level as Italian organizations, whether intelligence and strategy could substitute for the institutional advantages that came from ethnic solidarity and multi-generational criminal enterprises. Failure would prove that Harlem required external management, and that proof would justify dominance that might never be reversed. The real battle would not be fought with guns. The real battle would be fought in the 7 days following Schultz's elimination. when every ambitious operator in New York would see opportunity in the vacuum, and when maintaining order would require intelligence and discipline rather than the kind of theatrical violence that Schultz had deployed. Bumpy stood to leave, buttoning his coat against the October chill that would be waiting outside. Luciano remained seated, swirling wine in his glass. One more thing. Johnson. Schultz has been talking about killing Dewey. Talking about walking up to the prosecutor on the street and shooting him in broad daylight. That kind of madness is part of why he has to go. You kill a federal prosecutor, you bring down heat that does not cool off for a generation. The entire organization gets dismantled. Everyone goes to prison or cemetery, and everything we built collapses. Remember that when you are tempted to solve problems through violence that feels satisfying but produces consequences that last longer than the satisfaction. Violence could seize territory in a single night, overwhelming resistance through superior firepower. But violence could not hold territory against determined opposition, could not build the kind of stable infrastructure that allowed criminal enterprise to function profitably over years rather than weeks. Only discipline could accomplish that. Only the ability to demonstrate that cooperation produced better outcomes than conflict. That peace was more profitable than war. That intelligence properly applied could create order where chaos threatened to consume everything. October 23, 1935, 10:37 in the evening. And Dutch Schultz sat in the Palace Chop House in Newark eating steak and discussing plans to murder Thomas E. Dewey on a public street. Two men walked through the door carrying revolvers, and before Schultz could reach for his gun, bullets tore through his abdomen and liver, spinning him sideways onto the floor, where he would lie bleeding for 22 hours before dying in the hospital. Word reached Harlem before midnight, carried by runners who spread the news that the man who had terrorized the neighborhood for 2 years had been eliminated by the same organization he belonged to. Killed because his violence had become too loud and his ambitions too dangerous. Schultz's organization collapsed within hours. His collectors abandoned their routes and disappeared, understanding that loyalty to a dead boss was suicide. Some tried to align with Italian families downtown. Others attempted to establish independent operations. All of them understood that the next 72 hours would determine survival. Harlem faced two immediate threats. First, small-time operators who had been suppressed under Schultz would attempt to seize control of policy operations and numbers rackets, and competition would inevitably turn violent. Second, Italian families who had watched Luciano grant Harlem independence would test whether that independence could survive, sending collectors to demand tribute and enforcers to break bones if tribute was not paid. Day 1, October 24th, 6 in the morning. Bumpy met with the 3 largest policy bankers in Harlem in a basement on 135th Street, cold enough that breath came out visible. "Schultz is gone," Bumpy said, voice level and stripped of celebration. "That creates opportunity for those smart enough to recognize it, and disaster for those stupid enough to fight over scraps. You continue operations exactly as before. No expansion into territories that belong to others. No violence unless violence comes to you first. Follow these rules and you keep earning. Break these rules and you lose access to protection, to banking connections, to everything that makes this business profitable." All 3 chose cooperation, understanding that Bumpy was offering stability in exchange for discipline. Days 3 and 4 brought Stephanie St. Clair into public view. She appeared at the Cotton Club on October 26th, dressed in furs that cost more than most families earned in a year, walking through the front entrance with 2 bodyguards. She said nothing. Her presence announced that the old order had survived Schultz's elimination, and that anyone planning to challenge that order would be challenging a woman who had outlasted Dutch Schultz and would outlast anyone foolish enough to believe her gender made her weak. Day 5. Bumpy sent Theodore Green to meet with Reverend Clayton Powell Sr. at the Abyssinian Baptist Church. The message was simple. The war is over. The terror has ended. Anyone who attempts to restart the violence will be removed. Do not let your children get involved in what comes next. Do not let them think that carrying guns makes them men. Harlem needs builders more than it needs another generation of corpses. Days 6 and 7 brought quiet that felt unnatural after 2 years of chaos. Bumpy's network reported no territorial disputes, no collection wars, no bodies discovered in alleys with throats cut or skulls fractured from beatings. This reconstruction examines historical power dynamics for educational analysis, not as endorsement of criminal activity. Luciano kept his promise. No Italian collectors appeared in Harlem demanding tribute. No enforcers showed up to break fingers or burn buildings. The arrangement held because Bumpy had proven that Harlem could maintain order without external management. But the price was steep. Harlem had to operate cleaner than before, with less visible violence and tighter control over information that might leak to Dewey or other prosecutors. Every shooting, every beating, every act of brutality now became liability that threatened the entire arrangement. On October 30, word reached Bumpy that 3 young men had celebrated Schultz's removal by robbing a jewelry store on 125th Street, shooting the owner in the leg and escaping with merchandise worth maybe $500. The shooting made it newsworthy, and newsworthy meant attention from Dewey. Bumpy found the 3 men within 6 hours. They were 17, 16, and 15 years old. Children who had watched Schultz's men operate with impunity and concluded that violence without consequence was how power functioned. Bumpy did not kill them. He broke the oldest one's right hand with a hammer, methodically fracturing every bone from wrist to fingertips, then sent all 3 to juvenile detention through a police captain who owed favors. The message spread through Harlem faster than news of Schultz's death. The new order would not tolerate chaos that invited outside intervention. Violence that served no purpose except demonstrating willingness to commit violence would be punished through elimination of the capacity to continue committing violence. One of the young men's mothers came to Bumpy 3 days later, her son's hand wrapped in bandages that would need changing daily for months. "You broke my boy's hand," she said, voice shaking with rage and grief. "He cannot hold a pencil anymore. He cannot work. You crippled him." "I saved his life," Bumpy replied, his tone carrying no apology. "He was on a path that ended with him face down in the river with bullets in his spine. Now he has a chance to learn that stupidity has consequences and that intelligence is the only thing separating men who survive from men who become examples for the next generation." Harlem had achieved peace, but it was peace maintained through understanding that noise invited consequences nobody wanted. The new order was not freedom. It was a structure that allowed certain activities to continue as long as those activities remained invisible to people with power to dismantle everything. The new order was not a celebration. The new order was everyone understanding when to speak and when to remain silent, accepting that survival required submission to rules that protected the collective even when they constrained the individual. 1936 and Thomas E. Dewey accomplished what Dutch Schultz had died trying to prevent. Lucky Luciano was arrested on charges of running a prostitution ring, a case built on testimony from women who had been coerced and threatened until they agreed to say whatever Dewey needed them to say to secure conviction. The trial was designed to prove that organized crime could be defeated through aggressive prosecution, and Luciano's lawyers knew from the first day of testimony that they were fighting a battle already lost. Word spread through Harlem within hours of the arrest. The question on everyone's mind was simple and brutal in its implications. If Luciano went to prison, would the arrangement that protected Harlem's independence survive? Or would other Italian families view his incarceration as an opportunity to tear up agreements that had been made by a man who no longer had power to enforce them? The fear was not theoretical. Frank Costello. who would assume control of Luciano's operations during his imprisonment, had not been present for the chess games that established the arrangement. He had not witnessed Bumpy demonstrate intelligence that commanded respect. He had only heard stories, and stories could be dismissed as exaggeration or sentimentality that should not govern business decisions about who controlled territory and who paid tribute. June 5, 1936. 3 days before sentencing, Luciano requested one final chess game with Bumpy. The meeting arranged through lawyers and intermediaries who understood that this was not a social occasion, but rather diplomatic necessity. They met in a room at the courthouse where Luciano was being held. Guards standing outside the door, the atmosphere carrying the weight of endings rather than beginnings. The board was set up on a table that had been used for interrogations, wood-scarred with cigarette burns and initials carved by defendants who had sat here waiting to learn whether they would walk free or spend decades in cells where daylight arrived, filtered through bars. Luciano arranged the white pieces with hands that showed no tremor, despite the sentence he would receive in 72 hours. "This is the last game," Luciano said, his voice carrying the flat acceptance of a man who had lost bigger gambles than freedom, and understood that dwelling on loss accomplished nothing except demonstrating weakness. "After this, I am gone for 30 years, maybe 50, if Dewey gets his way. So what we establish today is what survives me. What we say today is what people remember when they decide whether to honor arrangements made by a man who can no longer punish violations." The game lasted 90 minutes, longer than their first match but shorter than some of the monthly games they had played over the past 8 months. Both men played carefully, testing positions and calculating variations with the thoroughness of professionals who understood that this board represented something larger than chess. Bumpy won by the narrowest margin, an endgame that came down to pawn races and king position, the kind of victory that demonstrated superiority without humiliating the loser. Luciano studied the final position for a long moment before extending his hand across the board. "You beat me 3 times out of 3. That is not luck. That is skill, and skill commands respect, regardless of where it comes from or what color the man possessing it happens to be." He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "I am going to prison, but the arrangement we established survives me. Anyone who violates it is violating my direct order. And in this organization, my orders do not expire just because I am no longer physically present to enforce them. Frank Costello knows this. The Commission knows this. Anyone who needs reminding will be reminded through methods that do not require my personal involvement." Bumpy remained seated, hands folded on the table. "And if someone decides that your orders no longer carry weight, if someone decides that a promise made by a man in prison is not worth the breath it took to speak it, then someone discovers that breaking my word is the same as breaking their own credibility." Luciano replied, "Reputation is the only currency that matters in this world. You break a promise I made. You are telling everyone that your word means nothing, that you cannot be trusted to honor agreements, that every deal you make comes with an expiration date. That kind of reputation gets you killed, not by me, but by the next man who decides he cannot do business with someone whose promises evaporate the moment enforcement becomes inconvenient." Lucky Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. He served 9 years before being released in 1946 as reward for his cooperation with military intelligence during World War II. Then immediately deported to Italy, where he would live in exile until his death in 1962, never again setting foot on American soil despite repeated attempts to return. Bumpy Johnson maintained influence in Harlem throughout Luciano's imprisonment and beyond. He was arrested in 1952 on narcotics charges and sentenced to 15 years, serving 11 before release in 1963. He returned to Harlem and continued operating until July 7, 1968, when he collapsed from a heart attack at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, dying before the ambulance arrived. He was 62 years old. Dutch Schultz died in the hospital on October 24, 1935, 22 hours after being shot in Newark. His organization dissolved completely within a week, his territory absorbed by the same families that had ordered his elimination. The reign of terror he had conducted in Harlem ended the moment the bullets entered his body. And within a month, most people had difficulty remembering exactly what he had looked like, or why they had been so afraid of a man who now existed only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting violence become louder than strategy. Frank Costello honored Luciano's arrangement with Harlem. Italian families continued to operate in other parts of New York. But Harlem remained independent territory where colored operators controlled policy and numbers rackets without paying tribute to downtown bosses. The arrangement was held not because Costello felt bound by sentiment or loyalty, but because breaking it would have damaged his reputation and invited questions about whether his word could be trusted in future negotiations. The new order established in September 1935 survived for 3 decades, outlasting the men who created it and becoming part of the invisible infrastructure that governed how New York's criminal enterprises divided territory and resolved disputes. Harlem had not gained independence through charity or through sympathy from organizations that viewed colored neighborhoods as revenue sources to be exploited. Harlem had gained independence by forcing the entire city to recognize that intelligence properly applied could defeat numerical superiority and institutional advantages. The question was never about strength measured in guns or soldiers, or the capacity to inflict violence that left bodies in the streets and buildings reduced to ash. The question was about willingness to sacrifice whatever was necessary to convert temporary victory into permanent structure, to transform a single chess game into a foundation for order that would survive beyond the lifespan of the men who established it. Bumpy Johnson had answered that question on September 20, 1935, and the answer had echoed through decades of relative peace in a neighborhood that had every reason to descend into chaos, but chose discipline instead. This story is shared for historical insight and personal reflection, not to promote violence or illegal behavior. Thank you for watching until the end. These stories take weeks of research and writing to create. If this resonated with you, if you see the lesson Bumpy Johnson was teaching about accountability and education over violence, hit that subscribe button. Help us reach 1 million subscribers so we can keep telling stories that matter. Stories about power used wisely. Stories about consequences faced honestly. Stories about men who chose to change systems instead of just destroying enemies. The next video drops soon. Until then, remember, real power is not what you can destroy. It is what you choose to build.